Hi friends, it's Scott Giroux with another episode of Power Apps Cafe. And in this and the next few episodes, actually, we're going to be looking at some of the things that I showed at the recent Power Platform conference in Orlando, which was awesome. I'm going to be showing an application that looks a bit like this. So we've got the Creator Kit being used here to create a custom user interface that looks very similar to the standard model-driven apps. So we got a grid that allows you to do things like sorting with custom formatting, and you can then with filtering, you can filter here and allows you to edit. So lots of great stuff. So if you're interested in that, stick around. So this app really makes heavy use of the Creator Kit, and the Creator Kit was released a short while ago, and it's really a bridge between where we are today and where eventually, hopefully, we will be. It's providing some controls such as the grid, tag picker, and face pile and things like that hopefully eventually will be available as native controls. And the key thing about these controls that are being provided is they look like the native model-driven controls because they're using Microsoft Fluent UI. So if we go back and take a look at the app here, you can see that what we've got is this grid here, which you can sort of scroll up and down in and do all of the sorting, and you can also resize. So, these are the kind of things that will be very difficult to implement if you are going to be doing this using standard Canvas components. Also, it's very performant because it's using a native React component rather than using the much higher level constructs that you get in a Canvas app. And you can then go and edit items, and you can provide user interfaces like in custom inline creation of, like in this case, custom inline creation of milestones, which perhaps using the standard model-driven experience in some situations would not be ideal. And one of the things I said in my presentation was very much about the fact that, yes, whilst you can do this, it's not necessarily you're going to do this for every part of your model-driven app. You really want to use it only where it's going to make the maximum benefit. Perhaps where the users spend most of their time, and you want that user interface to be really tailored for the task that they're doing many times a day repetitively. The other great thing about this is that using the Fluent UI controls allows you to, if we swap over into a kind of a mobile emulator here, you can see that it's responsive as well. So what's happening there is that you can see that when it's shown in a form factor which is similar to a mobile phone, the columns fold underneath each other so that they're not shown. You don't end up with a horizontal scroll bar. You can just see, so you just scroll up and down. And also you can see that instead of there being a sort of a large status indicator, it's just collapsed down that status indicator into a much smaller icon there. So, and then you'd interact with that in a touch way. And we've got the command bar as well. And then obviously being able to sort of show and hide the filters rather than showing the filters at all times. So there's very much a kind of a responsive element to model-driven apps because, of course, they have to work the same both inside the player on a Windows or a tablet or a phone or indeed a browser. So, and they need to be able to adapt to all these different form factors. Of course, the thing I got asked a lot was show me the code. So, I thought, well, we're going to have to do that in the next few episodes because I said, well, I'll do it on YouTube. But when I was doing that little kind of image there, which is obviously a common meme, I was looking at the Jerry Maguire footage that it came from where he's shouting, show me the money. And so I just said, well, let's just pause that and just rewind a little bit. And because I noticed something on his desktop there. There's a computer, very ancient looking computer, but there's something on his screen. And it kind of looked a bit like a Power App. So, using the power of AI to enhance that. And it's this SMI contact manager. And it's obviously showing him all of the contacts that he's not called and he needs to go and close his deals on. So I thought, well, given now that we've got this image upload preview where we can convert an image into a Canvas app. I thought, can I give it a go and feed that in? So I uploaded that, a contact manager image, into Power Apps, and it gave me this, which was, obviously far from ideal. So you can see where the Creator Kit comes in here. Maybe one day the AI capability will be so amazing that it'll be able to use all of these really flashy controls to make your user interface look really, really pretty. But in the meantime, we're going to have to do it manually. So I've got a custom page here. And what I've done is just created a responsive layout. So I thought what we should do is lay a good foundation in terms of understanding how we can create responsive layouts inside a custom page inside a model-driven app, so that we get that ability to show on different form factors. So there's a number of things that firstly we need to understand. Firstly, if we go into the app properties here, and we go down, you'll see here that there are a number of size breakpoints. Okay. And these size breakpoints are really mainly for sort of configuration, if you like, of variables that we can then use throughout the app to detect whether or not we are in a particular format. So you might say full size on a Windows desktop, or maybe on a tablet and on a phone. So you kind of configure these are the defaults. And so we can use those later on to detect at which point we've reached each of those breakpoints, and then start to show a different style of user interface depending on those conditions. Now, previously, we had to do this very manually. We had to use X and Y coordinates and calculations to reposition things very manually. But what we've got now is something called containers. And so if I was to go to add, I can go into my layout area. And at the bottom here, we've got a number of different types of containers. So we've got a horizontal container, vertical container, and just a standard container. And really the difference here is that the horizontal and vertical containers are kind of like stacks. If we put child components inside these elements, they're going to stack either horizontally, so in a row, or vertically in a column. And then we can define the behaviors of that stacking behavior. So for example, we might want it to wrap under some circumstances when it reaches a minimum width. We might want dynamic widths depending on to fill the available space, or we might want standard widths or heights. So there's lots of configuration we can create in there. Now, the standard container just down here, this is literally just something that would contain other controls. And so generally what you'll have is a horizontal or vertical container that then will have other controls inside it. And quite often one of the controls that you'll have inside those will be a container. But obviously it could be it could be a Canvas component, it could be anything else. So in my layout, what we've got here is at the root, we've got a vertical stacking container. Okay. What this allows me to do is to have the command bar across the top, which is a Creator Kit component. And then we've got another container, which is going to contain my filters. It's got nothing in it right now. And then we've got another container that's going to contain our grid. And at the moment, what it's got there is another Creator Kit component called the elevation. So if you run this, you can see here that it's kind of got some sort of nice shading to kind of give it that feeling of elevation. And we can change the level of elevation by going into the properties here. And so at the moment, it's just a depth of 4. But if I put the maximum depth, you can see there, it's sort of created a much bigger sense of elevation. So, you have to use it with a little bit of care, not to make it look too garish, but it's what the native user interfaces in model-driven apps are starting to show. So if I was wanting to grab these Creator Kit components, the way I do that is go into add, and you can see here under code components, I've currently got the command bar, the details list, the elevation icon, and picker. And the way to get these into our app is we use this get more components option at the bottom. And what that does is it brings up another dialog that one of the tabs here is the canvas. So this shows all the canvas components, which are purely just using the standard out of the box controls, like, text boxes and rectangles and things like that you get with Canvas. And then we've got at the top another tab called code. And if we select that, you can then see all of our code components. And you can see here all of these PowerCat components. These are the components that come with the Creator Kit. So I would select one of those and then they would become available inside my code components area. And when you're using components, container components like this area across the bottom becomes very important. It's like your breadcrumb trail of where you are located. So at the moment, you can see that I have selected the elevation grid. That then is the parent of that is the grid container, then there's the root container. So at any one time, I can select these elements, and then that allows me to control that particular container. So if I wanted to add an item to the root, I would have to make sure that my root container is selected. So if I was currently selected the elevation grid, it's quite a convenient way of selecting just that root container. I can just go back to it and then add another item into it. Another tip is in this container, which of course is configured as vertical. If I've put it onto my canvas as a vertical container, I can obviously change it to be horizontal if I wanted to. This is a drop down here. And also I can change the justification, whether and how components are going to sit inside that. So if I want to make them always aligned up to the top, or if I want to make them equally spaced or aligned to the bottom, or center them. And then the same for the horizontal behavior as well, whether or not I want to stretch them. So generally when you're creating responsive layouts, you want to stretch your container so it fills the available width, because obviously that's quite often the way that your user interface will work. It's always best to set these at the start, because then when you create child components, they will start to inherit that same behavior. The gap is then going to be the spacing between the child components. So that's very useful if you want to add, say, for example, lots of buttons in a row and you want to have some spacing between those buttons. And then if you want to have scroll bars, that's quite useful for if you've got a child container that then lots and lots of information that may overflow. That's how you would say, okay, show a scroll bar. And then wrapping is a very convenient way of making sure that if there isn't sufficient width or height, you can then wrap components onto the next line or onto the next column. So for example, if we head over back to our application here, if I go into the dashboard here, you can see that we've got these kind of cards that are being displayed that show lots of information. That this is like the home page. As I zoom in here, what you'll notice is that there's a minimum width of these cards, which at a certain point, you'll see that they're actually going to wrap down underneath each other. And so this is the power of these stacking horizontal and vertical containers with wrap behavior. They're very useful for this kind of user interface. And so you'll need to experiment around to kind of get the best experience that you want. And by using the browser, resizing is quite useful. To zoom in and zoom out, you can hold down control and use your mouse wheel to sort of zoom in and zoom out once you're playing the application to see how they respond to different widths being available. Again, this is so much better than it previously. When you wanted to do this, you'd have to kind of respond to the app.width or app.height. Another tip is if you go into the select an item inside your container, you can then use the actual arrow keys here to move the position around inside that root container. So you can see I'm moving the command bar to the top and the bottom. I don't need to kind of cut and paste it. So if I add in another container in here, then let's just say add in a horizontal container like this. You can see now that what we've got is another container placed underneath our grid container. Now, what you'll notice is that there's something special about this, because it's just now filled sort of half of the space available. And that's because what we've got if we look at the component properties for this lower container here, and we look at the height property. So if we go to the height area here, you'll see that, let's go in a little bit, zoom in a little bit more. Well, that was a bit more, a bit too much. So this area here is going to be the flexible height property. And that flexible height property is saying that actually, rather than say in the case of our command bar, which was just setting the pixel number of pixels height, and it's always going to be 32 pixels height, we can say that actually it's going to always try and occupy, in this case, we're saying one portion of two. So it's going to always fill 50% of the available height. And so if we were to say, let's actually say that fill the portions, let's say 2. So let's just see what that looks like. Fill proportions 2. And if I run this now, you can see here that what it's doing is it's now filling effectively a 2/3 of the available space. And so you can start to create very complex layouts using this style of user interface dynamic resizing. So also, let's go and add in some items to this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this up to the top. There we go. And I'm going to say, rather than this as being a flexible height, I'm going to give this a specific height of 32, like this. So actually now it's not going to dynamically resize. And I'm going to start to add in some buttons. So when I add a button in, just by adding in from the insert, I need to always make sure that I reselect the root container. Otherwise, it will then not add into that container. So every time I add a button, reselect the root container, and it keeps on adding it into the root container. So we've now got 3 buttons, but you can see here that they are sort of butted up against each other, which isn't very useful. And so what we've got is the ability to create, as I mentioned before, we can customize the gap. So if we make the gap like 8 pixels, so suddenly now we've got spacing between them, which is nice. But we can also create padding, add padding in. And what padding is simply, rather than it being the gap between and padding around each individual space, what the padding is just simply the left and the right. So I'm going to add in some sort of 32 top and bottom. Actually, no, not top and bottom, because that's just going to mean it's going to be too high. I'm going to put in 32 left and right padding. So that's going to be here. So you can see now we've got 32 pixels on the right and 32 pixels on the left, which just makes it much easier to lay out. And so rather than using, again, X, Y components to move things around, you can just apply these overall styles to your containers, and then makes it a lot easier. So of course now what I've got is if I've got button 1, button 2, and button 3, just let's give them a name here like that. And let's give it button 3. If I use the arrow keys, I can just sort of move them around, and it just makes it so much easier to lay things out. So that's all good. Now, the last thing I wanted to kind of point out here is that what you'll notice is that I've got a container inside this stack here. So these, as I mentioned before, these containers are just a standard container. They've got no stacking behavior. And what these are is allows us to add effectively like a group, but a lot easier to manage, because grouping is just simply a way of just abstractly grouping a number of controls so that you can apply the same properties to all of those controls. Whereas a container is literally just is something that contains other controls and then allows you to position those controls relative to the container. So if I positioned a control inside the container as X0, Y0, it's just going to appear at the top left of the container. And as I move the container around, obviously those child components will move with the container as well. So they're very useful for responsive layouts in that respect. And what I've got here is I've got a elevation added in, and I've positioned it right up the top, and I've given the elevation a little bit of some padding as well, padding left, padding right. So, but you'll notice that we've got 16 here. And the reason that is that I'm using a a variable here called U. And this is sort of like my margin, my standard unit of margins. And this is quite useful if you wanted to have variable levels of compact elements. So if you wanted to say show your user interface in a compact way or then in a standard way, you could then vary the value of U. And what I'm using is to create U, I'm using the new features of Power Apps, which is the formulas. And so I've defined U as 4. And so if I changed U, then because if I create this formula, so U is going to be available across all of my screens. I don't need to use any app on start or on visible event. I just define it once in the formulas, and then U is going to be available to all of my screens. If I change U here, you can see that it immediately will take effect. So there we go. It's moving around immediately. So as before, in my stack, if I go to my stack here and I change and I set my container padding to be U instead of as I created it before. So I'm going to set it at 4 times U here. Again, that will allow me to then vary that. So if I change it to 16, you can see here it's moving around dynamically. So it's a useful way of not having to decide on the spacing of your components when you're building them. And you can very easily, rather than having to go through all the individual padding and all the individual spacing gap elements after you've built your user interface. And the reason I added this container here as a child to the parent container, because of course I could just have added this elevation as a child to the root container. But the reason I did that is because I want to add other components on top of this elevation. So in this case, we're going to add a grid on top of the elevation. If I added the elevation directly inside the root, then I would never be able to superimpose anything on top of that. So by adding a container, that enables me to have the grid behind another component that I'll also add to this grid container as well. So I'd encourage you to try and experiment with these various different container configurations in a very, very simple way. I mean, and when you go and add a screen, actually, it does give you some examples of the use that you can have using containers. But in order to get true responsive containers, you may need to start to do a little bit more configuration of the stacking and the wrapping, etc. But what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to add a grid into this container. We're going to use the Creator Kit grid, and we're going to configure it so that depending on the format, that breakpoint, the size breakpoint, will show the grid in a subtly different way. So we'll fold columns in. So until the next episode, I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. So cheers for watching. Please subscribe and leave a like if you like what you saw. And please do let me know if you'd like to see something else, or if you'd like to explore anything else that I've just shown as well. So until next time, cheers.